This is one of the master.
Oh, sorry. As if the Indians wrote the history of what happened
I
to
have
them
some.
How you doing,
when
anybody?
Europeans came.
All right.
Oh.
You? Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Kat said my writing drives her crazy because she's an elementary kind of a person and I'm a college teacher. So college teachers never write as well as elementary teachers ever. I didn't get very good grades in my writing classes when I was young. So if you ever have a problem with my writing, like if I write too fast, I mean I didn't read that, but sometimes I just like write really fast. If you ever can't read something, just tell me and say, hey, I need to be able to read that. So I will then rewrite it.
If I wrote it, you wouldn't be able to.
Yeah.
Well, I am just telling yours or anyone, because I don't know.
That's like the neatest I would ever write like that. Like normally I'm like a, what do they call it? Pharmacist. Not a pharmacist, a doctor. Writing for a pharmacist. Yeah, like I just don't even think about it. And yeah, I never got good grades in handwriting in school ever. I tried, I struggled. I'm sorry?
I can't even read my own writing.
Really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
what did I write?
Okay, well let's go ahead and get started. Do you all have 3 pieces of paper?
Yep.
Yes.
So one should say, growing up Jewish in a Christian town. That's just something to read later because I've always given you something that's a personal, like a testimonial kind of a thing from someone who's a practitioner of every religion, because I'm not obviously a practitioner of every religion, so you can read that later on. And then for tonight, you'll need both of these out, the one called glossary. These are just the main Jewish terms that we'll be talking about in the next 2 or 3 sessions here. We won't end this tonight. There's just too much to cover, but we might be able to do it in 2 or 3 sessions. Well, we will in 3 for sure, but maybe even in 2. So, and then this one that says from the ancient Israelites to classical Judaism, and I'll walk you through some of those points in a little bit. So, before we get started, what comes to mind? Good, bad, right or wrong? Hi Tom, coming in. What comes to mind
Good morning.
when you think about Judaism? And I ask this with lots of religions. If you want to take one of each of those.
The start of just about everything.
Yeah, Western, right? Western religions, yes. Exactly, the start of, all the Western religions. I mean, Judaism is a beautiful religion and a meaningful religion, a profound religion in its own right. So it's not just the foundation for Christianity or the foundation for Islam. And I think sometimes that in Christian churches, like we are right now, and I'm a Christian pastor, sometimes we tend to present Judaism as if its very existence is a foundation for our tradition. But it's a foundation in its own right. It's a religion in its own right. And it has dramatically, profoundly influenced Western civilization. And then, of course, it's the foundation for Islam. So in these Western traditions, we're going to be talking about these 3 major Western religions. And Judaism is the foundation that Christianity is built on. And then Judaism and Christianity is the foundation that Islam is built on. I'm only making it smaller because they're newer. I don't mean that it's like, this isn't bigger numerically. It's just, this is the foundation for Christianity, and then Judaism and Christianity are foundations for Islam. And so Judaism is just so important to learn, I think, just the basics of it anyway. Have you ever been to a synagogue?
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to set up a synagogue field trip. Do you know one near here? Is there one near here?
I don't know, can we do it after October 13th?
Nothing.
Maybe.
After October 13th.
I haven't looked at dates yet, but I didn't know if there was one around here, but I'll look into it. Yeah, Sabbath services are really neat. They're really, really neat. They're often called Sabbath service or Shabbat service. Shabbat is a Hebrew word that means Sabbath. And so if you could look at that, did you all get the glossary? Did you get the glossary?
Yeah.
If you want, did you get one of each of these? Okay. So if you look at your glossary, as I have said many times, these world religions have so many terms in them that come from languages other than languages you might be used to. Do you know a lot of Greek? You know a lot of Greek. A lot of our church words, Christian church words, come from Greek. Remember studying Greek vocabulary and going, I know like 80% of these words. Like the words that we would think, like, gosh, now I'm blanking. Like evangelism is a Greek word. Or there's a churchy word called ecclesiology, which just means like the study of church. from ecclesia, which means church. So, I mean, you already know a lot of Greek, but you're so familiar with that. So our tradition in Christianity has a lot of Greek, and then if you're Roman Catholic, you also hear a lot of Latin. And then Judaism, though, has a lot of Hebrew. So that's why it's helpful sometimes to get papers like this that show the major terms, but I'll point those out. But one of the terms is Shabbat, which is Hebrew for 7. So what else comes to mind when you think about Judaism? Sorry, it's not 7, it's Hebrew for Sabbath, which means rest. So what is, sorry? Abraham, right. Abraham is the major prophet, the first major prophet of Judaism, who is also lifted up in Christianity and Islam as well. So that's one example of Judaism being a foundation. Any other prophets in Judaism that you can think of?
Moses.
Yeah, Moses, huge one right there, absolutely. Okay, so let's look into this amazing tradition, very, very rich. As I said, we'll not finish tonight, but there are a few major sections, and they kind of all weave together, but there's a few major ways I'm going to section this out. First, I'm going to be talking about some of the major beliefs, the foundational beliefs. Then I'll be talking about the history of Judaism, and Judaism cares about its history much more so than the people of some of the East Asian religions we've studied. Do you remember when we studied Zen Buddhism? And we said, or I said, Zen Buddhism doesn't put as much emphasis on their own historical tradition. I mean, there is history, there is a link and a lineage, but it's not as emphasized. And so we didn't emphasize it as much, and Taoism and some of those traditions as well. But Judaism puts a lot of emphasis on its historical foundation and its historical growth. Also, and as I've said many times, everything I ever say here is a stereotype or a generalization. There are always exceptions to everything I say. But in general, in religions, Eastern religions think that words get in the way. Okay, so we want to have as few words as possible. Remember that in Zen Buddhism, Shinto, Taoism, okay? Like pare it down. That's why you see Japanese landscape design as very pared down and minimalist and basics and all that, because words get in the way of direct experience with the divine. However you categorize the divine, whether you're thinking of it as Buddha nature or the Tao or some such thing, okay? In the West, however, words are seen as lovely, wonderful, let's have more of them. God gave us a brain, and so it's the mind too, and ways to express it. So in the Western traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, you have a lot more textbooks, texts, not just the sacred texts like the Bible, but texts about the text. You know, encyclopedia, like the Talmud is like an encyclopedia about the sacred text. So you have a lot more words, a lot more teachers and scholars and analysis, instead of a tradition of saying, no, that gets in the way of direct divine experience. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at a quote from a revered Jewish scholar. His name is Abraham Joshua Heschel. And he said, Judaism is not only the adherence to particular doctrines and observances, but Judaism is primarily living in the spiritual order of the Jewish people, the living in the Jews of the past and with the Jews of the present. It is not a doctrine, an idea, a faith, but primarily the covenant between God and God's people. So he's summarizing it in several ways. Now this is a renowned Jewish holy man of the 20th century, very respected. So he's not saying something that would be considered fringy or anything, but very mainstream. He's defining Judaism as primarily about the covenant between God and God's people. And he's emphasizing the Jews of the people. By the way, the word Jew isn't a bad word. Sometimes people think you can't call Jewish people Jews. It's not, it's only sometimes used like it's bad, but it's not a bad word. Jewish people call themselves Jews. So living with or in the Jews of the past and with the Jews of the present. This covenant then, let's talk about that. You probably have heard this term before. If you've studied the Old Testament, you probably have seen this word and known this concept. This covenant is this arrangement, this agreement that was established long ago between God and the ancient Israelites. First, through Abraham and then later through Moses. So God spoke to Moses on a mountain. Remember the name of the mountain?
No, did I hear you say the
Israelites?
Israelites?
Israelites.
The first,
Yes, the Israelites.
They're
People of Israel. So
Mount
God,
Sinai, oh, of course.
Mount Sinai, exactly, right. So God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. Paul, you look confused. Are you confused?
yeah,
So this covenant is a relationship established between God and at first and the ancient Israelites.
okay, the ancient Israelites were Jewish.
Yes, yes. Also sometimes called the Hebrews.
Yeah.
Synonym.
That's what I.
Synonym. Okay? But these are people that were eventually the people of Israel. And still are the people of Israel. But the ancient Israelites were a wandering tribe, in a sense, with lots of similarities to how we talked about primal religious traditions. There's a tradition, like an oral tradition, it wasn't written down for a very long time, an understanding of nature and all that. So this covenant was established between God and the people. Now, one thing I want to emphasize and underscore here is that Judaism has never been about God and the person, as in individual. That's not the emphasis. So you might hear in Christianity, particularly Protestant Christianity, which, by the way, Lutheranism is a subsection of Protestant Christianity. In Protestant Christianity, you often hear verbiage like, I'm reliant on God as my personal savior, or I know I'm going to go to heaven when I die, or the Holy Spirit is in me, right? Christianity is there's more of an emphasis on a personal spirituality. And we talk a lot in our church about how we're also the church, how we're also community. But the emphasis tends to sort of default into personal spirituality. Well, in Judaism, it doesn't. In Judaism, it's about the community. So, the Jewish community. So, this covenant then, this relationship was established between God and the Israelites, but through a prophet. So, the word prophet is a word that means mouthpiece. And these people... Mouthpiece. So, these people were like a mouthpiece of God. So, God utilized people to get some jobs done. And one of those jobs was establishing this covenant. So first loosely through Abraham, but then in a much more systematic way through Moses. Okay? Now this is in the Christian Bible too. We know these stories. So this is an agreement where it says, and this is laid out in Exodus 19, 5 through 6. Now this is in the Hebrew Bible before it's in our, like we don't own it as Christians before the Jewish people do. Okay? So this covenant says, God's promising that if, now this is conditional, if the Israelites would keep the covenant by obeying the law, or Torah, which means law, then they would be God's treasured possession and a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So do you see the if then? This is not a relationship where, God, you give me everything I need and I'm just going to do nothing. This is more like a marriage where the two parties are expected to both do their thing, to both live up to what they're expected to do. So they would then be this treasured possession, this kingdom of priests, and this holy nation. So because of this covenant, the Jews are understood to be God's chosen people. Now it's sort of like how when Shinto, remember we talked about Shinto, Japanese indigenous religion, how they talked about how they were divine and, descended from the gods. It wasn't like the Japanese were trying to say, and you all are not. Like you're all horrible people and we are better than you. It's that Japan didn't know anything else when the world seemed smaller thousands of years ago. And so Japan was just talking about how they have this connection with God. Okay? So this is similar, and it's similar in all indigenous religions, to talk about how we, the people, have this special chosen relationship with God. Now, the Israelites were aware of other tribes and other groups, and they tried very hard to stay away from them. Sometimes they had to go into battle with them. They tried to remain on their own, and they had questions about, Do I connect with these people or not? So it's not like they weren't aware, but their primary focus was not global. It was not worldwide. It was Israel. And so when they said, we are the chosen people, it's more about how we are so loved. We are so connected with God. It's like if Christian and Sophia, my kids, if they were like, Mom and Dad love us so much. It's not like they're emphasizing, and they don't love you, by the way. They're just emphasizing that they are loved. So that's this emphasis here. It's a great emphasis on group identity. So it's necessary to distinguish between what is called observant Jews and non-observant Jews. In Judaism, the most important thing is not belief, it's action. And this differs from what we're used to, particularly in Protestant Christianity. In Christianity, and particularly Protestantism, a little less so in Catholicism or Orthodoxy, what's important in Christianity is belief, the saving power of knowledge. That's all over the New Testament. The sense of belief or trust in God, that kind of knowledge. The importance of Protestant Christianity is not on behavior. We often say things like, you hear Christians say things like, well, I haven't gone to church in months, and I don't always read the Bible, and I don't even always pray, but I believe Jesus is my Savior. Do you see that emphasis, not on action, but on belief?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a head thing, not so much a doing thing. And then occasionally, you might hear a Catholic Christian say, do I have to do da-da-da-da-da-da in order for God to love me? They talk in the action terms, but that's not a Protestant focus. Okay? Now it's important, it's meaningful what we do, but it's not the primary thing. In Judaism, though, what's emphasized is the doing of it. It's the observing the commandment, meaning doing the commandment. Okay? So then you have Jews called observant Jews. Sometimes they are also called religious Jews. And then you have the section of non-observant Jews, or sometimes called cultural Jews. Now, there could always be people saying you're making it way too simplified, and I'm sure that I am. But there's a difference here of people saying, I am Jewish because of my ethnicity. I don't go to the synagogue. I don't eat kosher. I don't do the things. It's my cultural identity, or my ethnic and cultural identity. As opposed to an observant Jew is the person who's doing the things. Now, I've met Jews before. Now, I've met Jews that have deep faith, and their belief and their mindset and all that is very much in line with what they're doing. It's not just about doing. It's about belief as well. But I've also met Jews who say, I don't even know if God exists, and I'm just not sure, but I'm going to go to Sabbath service. I'm going to go to, these high holy days. I'm going to eat kosher. I'm going to do the things. And that's important.
In Israel, they'll say, I'm not a practicing Jew.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and
I think that's the one on the right.
Right, and yes, exactly, that would be this. But still, people would identify as Jewish, perhaps.
Yeah, boy.
I'm not a practicing Jew, but man, I'm Jew. Sometimes it's similar in Catholicism. You have somebody that says, I'm not a practicing Catholic, but then, if they got in a car accident, God forbid, they would take me to the Catholic hospital, right? Because I feel comfortable there. Catholicism is a touch like this, with the importance on doing the right thing.
Are those the guys with the big beards and big hats and all the black?
Jewish people?
Yeah, the ones
That's
on the left.
That's a segment of Judaism. The left of what?
Oh, no.
Observant
Up
on
there.
On the board.
Yes. But this would be further divided into different groups, and we'll get to that later. There are a few major divisions of observant Judaism, just as there is in Christianity. There are different denominations.
Those are like the Orthodox Jews.
Yeah, there could be Orthodox Jews or
Orthodox
Hasidic Jews. Yeah, exactly.
I
Okay,
got
so
wrong for something.
let's look at some of the central teachings, and none of this might, shock you. This might be like, it's totally obvious because you're a Western person, and so it might be much more obvious to you than when I taught like Hinduism or something that you would never heard of, and you're not swimming in the waters of Eastern Hemisphere here. I mean, you're living among Western thinking people, so this might sound much more familiar. God's revelation of God's divine will to the chosen people is recorded in the Hebrew Bible. And you are familiar with the Hebrew Bible. It's generally called the Old Testament, well, we would call the Old Testament. Now, Jewish people don't call it the Old Testament because there's nothing new after that. The New Testament, what we call the New Testament, is about Jesus and the early Christian church. So Judaism doesn't talk about that, or they'd call themselves Christians. so there's the Old Testament. Now there's some other sacred books as well, but the most sacred, of course, is the Hebrew Bible. So observant Jews, these are practicing Jews, venerate God so deeply and so constantly that they actually avoid pronouncing the holy name of God. And remember, words are sacred. Words are important. Don't pronounce something that's too holy. It's a fascinating thought, right? In the beginning of creation, when God was creating the world, God spoke the world into being. Through the word, there's creative power. And then in Proverbs and in some other books, we're told that we, made in the image of God, also, hi.
Is here learning English?
No, not here. I'm so sorry. I don't.
Okay.
Kevin, do you know about English class?
No.
No.
Oh, okay.
There's
There's a
another
church
church
down
down the way.
Another?
Yeah,
Yes.
it's a Mormon church. And
Yes.
I know they have an Asian group that meets there, and I don't know.
Down that way.
Yeah, just down
Oh.
a short way.
Yeah.
Just a
Short
little.
way.
Okay.
It's a
Yeah,
bigger
thank you very
church.
much.
Okay.
Okay. Good luck.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like learning Hebrew maybe, but not English. So, okay. So what was I saying? So we people, we are made in the image of God, and we also have creative power in much smaller ways, of course, than God does. And God creates through speech, right? God spoke the world into being, and so too we speak things into being. I mean, the Roman Empire was spoken into being. I mean, of course, it was built and all that, but you've got to speak things for things to happen. And we can speak beautiful things into being, and we can speak horribly destructive things into being. But the point is that words have power. So in Judaism, observant Jews avoid pronouncing the name of God because it's too holy. Now, the name of God is Yahweh, and I'm only able to say that because I'm not Jewish, and so I don't have that thing where I can't say this. But Yahweh is Hebrew letters, and I'm not writing in Hebrew right now, but these would be the equivalent of the Hebrew letters. These are our alphabet, but these are the equivalent. Hebrew has no vowels. So the early rabbis placed vowels into the words so that people would have some idea of how to read these words and how to pronounce them. And so the vowels, I can't write in Hebrew. I can read it a lot. I took it in class, but I need like software to help me read it. But Hebrew reads from right to left, and the letters, the consonants are more like this, and then the vowels are more like lines and dots underneath that signify what vowel sounds you are to say. So the YHWH basically is an acronym. You know what an acronym is? Like NASA is an acronym. Okay, so an acronym that stands for I am that I am. Okay, so Moses said to God, what's your name? Who do I tell the people you are? And God responds, I am, or I am that I am.
Just
Just pure.
Yahweh.
Well, God didn't say Yahweh. God said I am that I am, or just I am. So, but that's abbreviated as Yahweh, okay? So Yahweh then, and that's why we pronounce it Yahweh as if it's spelled like Y-A-H-W-E-H, and then it's been Latinized also to Jehovah from like J, because Y and J are actually similar in, long story, anyway, J-H-V, which is similar to the W-H, so that's how we get Jehovah in Latinized form. So anyway, and in the Old Testament where it says Lord and it's in all caps, when it's in all caps, that's signifying that in Hebrew, if you looked at the original Hebrew, it would say that. It's not screaming the word Lord or anything. It's like a signal that it was in. So when a Jewish person is reading from the Hebrew Bible, which is in entirely the language of Hebrew, the Old Testament was in Hebrew originally, and they run across this, they don't say it. They say something like, they might say Lord, or they might, which is an entirely different Hebrew word than Yahweh. They might say Lord, they might say Master of the Universe, or some other title that signifies that everybody knows what they're looking at, but they're not going to say it.
And how do they pray to, if they can't, you know,
Pray silently or pray out loud?
out loud? I mean, because we always say.
Out loud they say
God,
Lord, or
they
they,
just-
yes, and many of my students actually turned in papers.
But I thought you said they can't, oh, they can say Lord, but they can't say.
Right. It's a different,
It,
Lord is a different
it
word.
would be equivalent to if you would not say, Stephanie, because that's too,
Yeah, familiar.
from the,
Yeah.
yeah, that,
You
that-
can, don't worry, it's not a rule. But a lot of
Yeah,
people don't,
it's-
yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, in those times, the name of a person was very, very, very important.
Yeah.
To know a person's name was a very powerful thing.
Yeah.
When Jacob
Yeah.
wrestled with the angel, he said, "What's your name?"
Yeah.
It wasn't, "Hey, you know, buddy, what's," you know, there
Yeah.
was a very important. So that's where the importance.
Yeah.
You know, you don't say God's name.
Yeah.
Yahweh and God are the same.
No. In Hebrew, God is the
No,
English.
Lord, I mean Lord.
That's another Hebrew word.
Yahweh and Lord.
No.
It's,
In this is Adonai in Hebrew. God is El or Elohim, which pluralizes God.
in Jewish, are you trying to?
I'm speaking Hebrew. Yes.
Yeah, no. I just want to know, Lord, which is our God, Lord and Yahweh, which is,
Or are you asking me as a Christian if Jesus and God are the same?
no, Yahweh and Lord.
No, what you're, it's like,
No, it's not.
not even abbreviate, it's a pseudonym.
Right, it's another term. It's like if somehow I was forbidden from calling you Paul for whatever reason.
Well, that's a good.
Then I would call you some nickname so you would know I'm referring to you, like guy in charge or person in the Patriot t-shirt or something. Like I would call you something. He's got a Patriot t-shirt. Something to refer to you, you know, and so that you and everybody else would know who I'm talking about. So Lord means Lord. It means like the Lord of a manor or the Lord of a castle, or it's a title. It's not a name. Yahweh is the name of God. It's too personal for us to say. It's too, like we were saying, it's too familiar for us to say. And yes, in ancient times, and this is important to remember in the New Testament as well, every time someone has a name change, you know, you get Abram and Sarai, now they're Abraham and Sarah, right? You had Saul of Damascus, and now he's Paul. Every time there's a name change, that is super profound. It means a complete identity change. It's like a baptism. A complete identity change. Names are really important. So here when we have, we're not going to pronounce the name. Now part of that is because it's too intimate. It's the very name of God. But another thought is that when Moses said, hey, what's your name? I want to tell them who you are. God basically answered, no, you don't get that. You just get that I exist. Like a withholding of the name. Like you're trying to get too close. Okay, so, and in the Old Testament, we see a lot of imagery of that you can't get too close to God, I mean, Moses did at one point, his face was shining, but did you ever see Raiders of the Lost Ark? You know when they opened the Ark of the Covenant and saw the Ten Commandments and like their faces melted off, right? It's like it's too powerful. And so one thought is that God basically told Moses, this is my name. My name is pure presence. I am. Another thought is that God was like, I'm not going to give you my name. It's too much. It's too close. It's too powerful. Probably kill you to know it. So I'm just going to say it's good enough that you just know that I exist. Okay?
Spring bean.
Yes.
Isn't there something even to the fact, you know, I mean, they're in Egypt and you've got Ra and Isis and all
Lots
these
of names.
all these other names of gods.
Yeah.
You know, this god is about fertility. This one's
Yes.
about
It's the sun or whatever.
whatever,
Mhm.
you know, and not to identify in that type of context.
Right. So this is just, pure holy presence. So, and then another interesting thing, we're gonna like get really sidetracked here in a minute, so this is the last thing about this. When you read Genesis, there are two accounts of creation. So it has been traditionally thought that Genesis was like handed over on a silver platter to Moses, along with the first 5 books of the Bible, all of the Torah. But now scholars think very far and wide that it was not done that way, that you have different people interacting, because you have somebody who does one account of creation, then you have literally in your Bible, if you open it up, it says the second account of creation. And you see another one. Well, first of all, it looks like there was one author, a second author, and then another author that wrote other things, and then an editor that put it all together. Now, in one of those accounts of creation, God is called Yahweh. In the other account of creation, God is called Elohim.
What?
Elohim means God. It literally means the word God.
Never heard it.
So when you see like Temple Beth El, anything with that L, that means God.
You
But-
you have seen it. You heard Israel.
Israel, any L means God.
Oh.
Okay, now Im is how you pluralize something in Hebrew. You know how in English I have one dog, but I have 2 dogs. S is how you pluralize things in English, right? You add an S,
Yeah.
or an ES, or an IES, or whatever. But Im is how you pluralize something in Hebrew. So in one account of creation, you hear about Yahweh doing, creating. In another account, you hear about God, plural. Kind of weird.
Repeat.
Could be. That's a very Christian interpretation, but I'm with you because I'm a Christian too. But some others talk about God speaking to the earth, it's harder for me to keep up with Jewish theology. Christian theology is like, well, there's 3 in 1 right there. I mean, we could easily answer that. But anyway, so in the, if you look at this scholarly, one account of creation is called the J tradition. The other one is called the E tradition, or the J account of creation and the E account of creation. So this means God, that means Yahweh. Okay? So, back to this. When people are reading, you go to a bar mitzvah or something, that's where a 13-year-old boy, rite of passage, stands up and reads in Hebrew in front of the entire congregation. They read right to left. He, or if it's a girl, she will do a bat mitzvah, which means son of the commandment or daughter of the commandment. They won't even touch the scroll. The scroll is too sacred. Yeah, they unroll it, but then they will have a pointer, which it's like a gold pointer or a brass pointer, which on the end has a little, it looks like a finger. It looks like a finger, look it up. It looks like a little finger pointing. And they will do this to keep their place. So even the scroll, even the words, it's too sacred to even touch. There's so much reverence for the word. If you go to a Sabbath service, and hopefully we'll be able to get one figured out where we could go, the Torah is brought out at every Sabbath service. So when the rabbi is standing up here, there's a big cabinet called the Ark. And the rabbi will open it up and take out a big scroll that's in a velvet case with beautiful decorations on it. I don't know, they're all a couple of decorations. So they take it out of the cave very ceremoniously, take it out, and then walk around, or maybe they don't take it out quite yet, they take it out when they read it, but they walk around holding it by the people. And the people will kiss their fingers and put it on the scroll, and they'll bow toward it. There's so much reverence for the written word. The Bible, the Hebrew Bible, is so important. So, and then they bring that up, and then they unroll it, and then they'll do a reading from it, and then you'll hear a passage like a sermon, from the rabbi. So, anyway, there's just so much importance in the written and the spoken word. Okay, so there is a God. There is one God. To us, that seems like a no-brainer. To Judaism, this was a radical departure from everything everybody was saying. Because everybody was saying thousands of years ago is that there's many gods. Like you were saying, Kevin, like in Egypt. There's the storm god, there's the moon god, there's the sun god. It's more obvious to think that there's a god for this and a god for that and a god for the other thing. Or personal gods, family gods, tribal gods, gods for this group, gods for that group, my God, your God kind of a thing. So when the ancient Israelites, starting with Abraham, when they came out and said, no, we really believe that there's only one, that was like, what? Totally changed the religious landscape, which thousands of years later, we're still saying. And that's the largest contribution to Western civilization that Judaism gave, that there ever even could only be one God. No primal religions said that. So that sense that there is one God to us might seem very like, yeah, that's totally obvious. But to the Jewish tradition, because they were the first ones to say this, to stand for this, to stand up for this, that's something that is repeated every single day. So the central tenet, the theological tenet of Judaism is called the Shema. It's probably written on your glossary. Do you see Shema on your glossary? Okay, so that's a theological statement that's said daily, and it is a statement that probably sounds familiar to you. It's Hebrew for hear, and it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." It is a statement of monotheism. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's the most beloved and basic theological statement. That's
This says alone.
Yes, the Lord alone. Sorry, yes, the Lord alone. So Deuteronomy 6:4 in the Tanakh, and Tanakh is the Hebrew Bible. I'll get to that in a minute, but that means the Hebrew Bible. So it's recited at least twice daily in morning and evening prayers. So it was a radical religious development of Judaism, a radical religious departure from what everybody else was doing at the time, and so it's very protected and honored still today.
Well,
Okay.
That's when they were, before Abraham, they were doing all sorts of funny things. The Jewish people.
Well, yeah, I mean, there really wasn't a people at that point, but Abraham was called to be like beginning this. And remember, he was the one that was told that he would have a child, and that child would be the father of many nations. And his wife Sarah was up in years, it says, and he was shown the stars in the sky and told, your descendants will be as many as the stars in the sky, and it just blew his mind, But yeah, so he's looked at as the father of all of us. That's why we sing that song, Father Abraham had many sons, because he's like the beginning of this whole thing. So when we talk about the religions of Abraham, or the traditions of Abraham, or the Abrahamic faiths, we mean Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All three religions trace their beginning back to him. Now, not their beginning in terms of creation. Obviously, there's Adam and Eve that came before, but in terms of more of an established covenant tradition. Okay? All right, another important term in Judaism is Torah. And you might have heard of Torah before. Have you heard of this term?
Yes.
Okay, it literally means law, and it does not refer to the law of the land, it refers to God's law. But it is relatively new historically that any country can have a law of the land that's thought to be separate from God's law. The separation of church and state thing is a really historically new concept. We're still trying to have a grand experiment to see if it'll work out. So when we look at like the Middle East, for instance, and some of the countries there, and we say, why on earth can't they separate church and state? Why is the law of the land, why is the law of God also the law of land, or whatever? It's because that's what's normal. That's been the typical thing. We are the atypical thing, So here talking about law does not necessarily mean the law of the land, it means God's law, but then that eventually translated into also the law of the land, the law of the people. There really was no sense in separating that. So Torah also means will, or God's will, like what God wants to be done. And it can also mean instruction. So the Hebrew Bible then contains three major parts. And those parts are the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Torah, prophets, and writings. So in Hebrew, the words Torah, prophets, and writings begin with the letters T for an equivalent of T for Torah, an equivalent of N for prophets, it's a long word for prophets, and K for writings. Okay, in another language. So again, this is an acronym that then vowels were added, and we call this the Tanakh. See how they got that out of this? Okay, so there's the T, there's the N, there's the K, and it's called the Tanakh.
What's with the H?
Now I just added because Hebrew does that. So the Tanakh is synonymous with Hebrew Bible. So when you think of what we would call as Christians the Old Testament, think of the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. So if you think of like a bullseye with the most important thing in the center of the bullseye, and then concentric circles going out from there where there are important things but not the most important things. Okay? In Judaism, what's most important is God. Okay? Understandably, right? Right out from there is the will of God. Okay? What God wants to be done, what God wants us to believe, what God, the will of God. So the will of God is most explicitly given to us in the Torah. The Torah contains the first 5 books of the Bible. And many of you, maybe all of you have read them. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those 5 books are the most sacred in the Jewish tradition. And like I said, traditionally it's thought that they were just all given to Moses. It's not thought that anymore. But it's still seen as the most sacred text. So in the Torah, God revealed its contents once and for all time at Mount Sinai to Moses, and that is the law. The Torah is the law. It stands as Judaism's central code of holiness, and it will stand forever. So within the Torah, we have the most recognizable laws. What do you think they are? What are the most recognizable laws? The 10 Commandments, right? Pretty obvious, pretty recognizable. But that's not all. There are other laws too. In fact, there are 613 specific laws in the Torah. Now, in our Bible study that we have here, we didn't count them all up, but we could. You could open your Bible and you can go 1, 2, 3, do this if this happens, do that if that happens. So it's not that all the laws are for everybody. Some are only for the priests, and some are only for men or women or whatever, or childbearing women, things like that. But 613 specific laws in the
Those are the
Torah.
laws that were written by man.
Well, it's debated. I mean, because Jesus definitely, in our tradition, now I'm skipping over traditions here, and so if Jewish people are listening on YouTube, forgive the, here I am skipping traditions. In the Christian tradition, Jesus said exactly what you're saying, that a lot of these were written by man, that God did give the law, but then people tend to keep pouring on the law. Why? Because we think the law will save us. And according to Luther, who looked at Jesus, the law cannot save us. We're not perfect. It's never going to happen. And so we need grace. But I get into Christianity now, and I don't want to do that. So in Judaism, these are lifted up, these laws. And the most famous, of course, are still the 10 Commandments in Judaism as well as in Christianity. So every synagogue, which is a building of Jewish worship, is synagogue written on your paper? So I don't have to spell that out. You see that? No? Okay. Right here. So you're familiar with this term, right? Synagogue is a building of Jewish worship. It is not the temple or one temple in Israel, which doesn't exist anymore, but we'll get to that later. But in every synagogue, the entire Torah is kept in a vessel called the Ark. So then we have the prophets. And the prophets, you might also be familiar with. Here's a list of the prophets: Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then 12 minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So, you don't need to write all that down, but just know you're probably familiar with at least some of this, right? Some of the prophets, some of the major prophets, especially like Isaiah. Isaiah? Jesus quoted from the scroll of Isaiah. I mean, Jesus unrolled the scroll of Isaiah in a synagogue and quoted it. Jeremiah is another really big one. So anyway, this part of the Bible then, so we have the Torah, but then the second part is the prophets, and what they all have in common is that they're all prophets. Does that make sense? Now, a prophet, I wrote it up there earlier, a mouthpiece of God, is a person who was called on by God to get the Israelites back on track when they were going astray. So the covenant was a road that they were supposed to be walking down together with God. God was not somewhere far away. God was with them in history. God was a partner in their historical development. And yet sometimes the people tended to veer off the path. Now remember, Judaism is not about individuals as much as it's about the community, the group. So it was never like just this person went astray. You hear that sometimes, like David went astray, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But what you hear mostly is the Israelites as a whole went astray. So the prophets then were called upon by God to get the people back on the path, often by telling them very loudly and profoundly, you are going way off the path. God is not happy with this. They were not subtle, really. They were pretty bold. These prophets were not people that wanted to grow up and be a prophet as a career choice. In fact, usually they protested when God was calling them to be a prophet. Like Jeremiah, who said, I'm just a boy, I can't possibly do this. But God said, I will put my words within your mouth. And I've chosen you, Jeremiah, before you were born to do this. It's like Moses, no, I can't possibly have a speech impediment. The prophets are often doing that. I can't. And God's like, you don't, it's not about the skills you bring to this. It's about, me, God, being there with you and giving you the words to say. So those are the prophets, and they've been an important part of the Bible for years, because Jewish people don't just see it as a history lesson, but as a reminder to stay on the path, stay on track with God. Okay, the writings. This group, pardon me, this group called the writings, what they have in common is that they're all writings. Because other than that, they're super diverse. They are Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So you don't need to write all that down. I can tell you later if you really want to.
So it's all the ones that aren't either the prophets or
anything. It's not the Torah or the prophets. Yeah. So you get poetry like Psalms and Song of Solomon. It's very poetic. You get absolute wisdom. Well, Song of Solomon is probably sort of considered wisdom literature because it might be written by Solomon. Certainly Proverbs is wisdom literature. You get histories like in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So it's just, it's kind of, they're all over the place. But they contribute to the richness of the whole of the Tanakh.
Are there books in the Tanakh that are not in our Old Testament?
No. No. Nope. So we got that handed to us. Yeah. Okay, so if you can think about this bullseye then, and you have God in the center and the will of God, on the outside, and most especially the Torah, but then the writings and the prophets and the whole Tanakh, then you go further out in another ring. So what happened was, the Tanakh was taught through oral tradition mostly for a really long time, as most indigenous religions are. But eventually rabbis would write them down and had different scrolls and stuff. And so the will of God was always thought to be continually revealing itself. It wasn't just revealed at one point and then it stopped. And there would be instances that the rabbis would encounter that the Tanakh didn't mention. Not everything in life is mentioned in any particular text. I mean, we get our Holy Bible, but the internet isn't mentioned. Who knew? Right? And so sometimes you have to deal with, well, how do we deal with the internet? And so what happened was, the rabbis would say, well, things aren't mentioned in the Tanakh, ethical questions and so forth. And remember, this is a tradition that really values the mind, really values analytical thought, really values scholarship, really values the word. And so the rabbis would get together and debate and discuss and debate and discuss. Eventually, that culminated in more philosophical thinking. And it was written down into what is called the Mishnah. Is that on your paper?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so the Mishnah is thought to be sacred, but not nearly as sacred as the Tanakh. It's not the Hebrew Bible, of course. It was written down in about the year 200, but it had ideas that were transmitted orally for hundreds of years before that. One thing that's fascinating that I noticed when I took a group of people to a Sabbath service a couple of years ago was that the rabbi said, that I was talking to, he said, you can also come to before the Sabbath service, it's like an hour-long service, you can also come to the Torah study, which is before the service. And I said, I'll certainly ask my people at the Lutheran church where I served, but I don't know if they're going to want to do both. I'm not sure if they have that much time. And he said, okay, if they don't have that much time, tell them to just go to the Torah study. Now that would be different than what I would say, right?
Right.
If I had guests coming and they said I only have an hour, I wouldn't say just go to Bible study. I would say go to worship,
Right.
right? So when he said just go to Torah study, I was like, that kind of sparked curiosity. So I told my class this, and we went to the Torah study, and then most of them also stayed for the Sabbath service. The Torah study was absolutely fascinating. So we went into this room, probably no bigger than this, but not too much bigger than this. But people were packed in every corner of the room. I mean, sitting around a table, but there were a lot of people, probably 75 people there. And probably only 10 that were my folks, but from the synagogue, you know? And they, in an hour, debated, and I mean debated, 3 verses of Deuteronomy, which is totally different than how I'm leading this current Bible study after worship, where we are flying through large sections. 3 verses in an hour. Now, the way they did it was that they talked about every possible scenario where that could have come up. So the verses were about not ripping off your neighbor, basically, like not swindling your neighbor. So one guy was like, well, okay, so then what would happen if, like, say, I want to order a big television on Amazon? Would it be okay for me to go into Best Buy and ask the salesperson to show me that TV and take up that salesperson's time, but knowing I'm never going to buy from that salesperson? So see how, like, looking it up. And then some guy goes, well, I think, you know, this and that. And then another woman says, I totally disagree. And I think the other. Fascinating conversation. But what was interesting was not only that they were really opening up scripture in every possible way they could apply it or not apply it, or it would make sense or not make sense, but the other fascinating thing was that they were kind of yelling at each other, but lovingly. like if I was saying, you know, Mary, I absolutely think you're wrong, with that kind of passion. So my folks were like, you know, the little, you know, like Norwegian Lutherans were like, because that's not our tradition to be quite that.
Ben said that once.
but we saw in the room that it wasn't out of hostility, it wasn't out of animosity, it was out of absolute love and respect for one another and trying together to get to truth. Through this kind of, it's almost like that rabbinic dialogue of the past, this kind of debate and almost sparring. It was fascinating. So anyway, that's the kind of tradition that for thousands of years the rabbis and many others have engaged in. That kind of, you know, back and forth, trying to get to truth verbally. So anyway, a lot of these truths then that were figured out or that were discovered or that were analyzed, they were written down in the Mishnah. Okay, so then later on, there came to be more issues that were not written about in the Mishnah, because time marches on, new things happen, and so a new series of texts were eventually written, the Talmud. Have you heard of the Talmud?
Yeah.
So a lot of rabbinic students study the Talmud. It's based directly on the Mishnah, so you have a small portion of the Mishnah cited and then explained with backup from the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible. And the rabbis cite all their arguments by citing all these biblical passages. The Talmud continues to be interpreted, and we have more and more texts today, but those are the most important ones at this point. The Talmud itself is a huge, massive work spanning thousands of pages, and there have been people throughout history that have memorized the entire thing. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, go ahead and memorize the Bible, word for word. You know, right? That's incredible, isn't it? So,
In Hebrew?
yeah. So you have this you know, ring of concentric circles like on a tree. You know, so you have God in the middle, and then God's will, which is most clearly represented through the Tanakh, but especially the Torah, and then the prophets, and then the writings, which together are very sacred. And then you have the ring of the Mishnah, and then you have the ring of the Talmud. So all of them are considered sacred, but less so the further you get out from the center. I really love this visual, because in the Christian church, in different ways, we can think that way too. And again, here I'm going off of Judaism for a minute as your Christian pastor, because I think this is really useful. In our tradition, and I remember hearing Bishop Murray Fink, do you know Bishop Murray? Okay, he's our Bishop Emeritus now. I remember him doing the exact bullseye thing, where he talked about how in the center is the cross, right? It's where God meets humanity. I mean, we could put God there too, but it's where God came down and met us and in our pain and suffering and healed the world and, you know, all that. So we can be of all different thoughts about all kinds of things, but we can agree on the main thing, right?
Right.
If you didn't agree on that, and I don't mean having doubts and questions and all that, everybody should really have doubts and wrestle just to kind of grow and learn in their faith and all that. So I don't mean like you have to perfectly, you know, but I mean if you absolutely had no interest in this whatsoever, you probably wouldn't even be here. You probably wouldn't even call yourself Christian. Like that's the main thing about being a Christian. And then you have other things out here. So like sacraments are out here. You know, and they're super important because they're a way to have kind of a portal to understand God, but they're not quite as sacred as like God himself, right? And then you have the Word or the Bible, again, incredibly important to be able to understand God, but we don't worship the Bible. You know, that's idolatry because the Bible's not God. The Bible's a window through which to seek God, understand God, so it's super important. And then you have things like, you know, church, community, and ways we do things, and then you have, you know, way out here, you're going to have people with differing beliefs. So like we saw, those of you who came to the sanctuary discussion, we saw a variety of beliefs, right? And that's okay, because we're going to have a variety of beliefs and thoughts and political views and on and on and on. No two of us are identical. And part of what is cool is that we don't have to be identical, because we don't come together because of that. We come together because of that, right?
Right.
And so you're never going to have, just like you've sat around with your family at Thanksgiving, no two of you are exactly alike. I don't care who you are, what family, even if you're identical twins, no two of you are identical. So it's enough that we have this, and then we can think differently and talk differently and learn how to get along and be actually, I think, an example to the world of like how to break bread together and get along even when we're different in some things, and that's okay. So anyway, I like that. He did that. Remember the 2009 sexuality decision? With it, that the ELCA was doing, where some people were upset and leaving and staying and wrestling on, and he was like, hey, you can all have different beliefs. It's okay, we have room for that. We don't meet because of that. We meet because of that, you know? So anyway, that was, I really like that model right there, to remember the main thing is the main thing. Okay, any thoughts or questions so far? Let's do just a little bit more, and then I think we'll have some talk at your tables about some things. Okay, so originally the Jews were descendants of the ancient Israelites, who are also known as the Hebrews, and around the time of the exile and following, they became known as the Jews, not just the Israelites, but the Jews, because their land was Judah, also known as Judea, just to confuse the issue. And conversion to Judaism was pretty common in ancient times. It is less so now. Judaism is not an evangelical kind of religion, like going out and sharing the good news. There are two religions that are quite evangelical in this world, and that's Christianity and Buddhism. Those are the two that are wanting to like teach and share and offer and kind of get out there. Judaism does not do that really. So I mean, some people convert, like if they want to marry a Jewish person and then they say, you know, I want to be Jewish too, so we can raise our kids, you know, Judaism, whatever. But it's, you know, and it still happens, but it's not super common. There is no single Jewish race, quote unquote, use my air quotes, of genetically related people because of all of this conversion. You know, so people that are Jewish come from different countries, different backgrounds. There's no one genetically related group, as if Jews today are like the ancient Israelites that were all very probably genetically related in
Yet
some
they
way.
always draw them as a certain
group, yeah, because there's a sense of like very close identity, and then there's a sense of having a holy land that's common to all of the people. So there are those things that seem to bring them together. But like during Nazi Germany time, there was a pseudo-science, which was not a science at all, totally bogus, totally false, that said that there was this race of genetically Jewish people and you know, you can know them by certain features, and it's just absolutely untrue. So it's not a race, but it is in some ways or often an ethnic group. So there is an ethnic commonality with many of them, but that's not even 100%, because you do have Jewish conversions still today
Sammy Davis Jr.
all over the world. Yeah, exactly.
Hey.
All over the world. So history has a lot of significance for Judaism, because history in Judaism shows that God is providential. Providential is that word that means that God is moving in and out throughout history. So, you know, the timeline is moving on like this, and instead of God being above it, somehow God's like weaving in and out through it. And so it's important to know history to know where God is in our Israelite Jewish history. Okay, I'm going to walk you through at least a little bit of history, and we'll probably continue this next time. But let's look at it a little bit now. Look at the paper that says, From the Ancient Israelites to Classical Judaism. I think it's important to understand Jewish history to understand who the Jews of today are as well, because of this trajectory that they've gone through. So, this is from a book that breaks thousands of years of history, like 4,000 years of history, into just a few paragraphs. So this is one section of history called Ancient Israelite History, and then we're going to move into a section called Classical Judaism, and then we have Medieval Judaism, and then Modern Judaism. So this is the Ancient Israelite History in basically 4 paragraphs. So in the first one, that's just entitled here, The Patriarchs. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was approximately 4,000 years ago. This is where God began the whole thing with Abraham, saying, I'm going to lead you from your home to the promised land of Canaan, and the covenant will be established. The mark of the covenant is male circumcision, and you and your wife, now named Sarah, will have a son, and you are going to start this whole thing. Okay? Familiar with that story? Mm-hmm. Okay. Next, you get into the next section called Exodus and Revelation. So, the Israelites moved from the land of Canaan that Abraham and Sarah went to Egypt. Why? Why'd they go to Egypt?
Food.
Famine. They were starving, right? And Egypt had food, which is the whole story of Joseph.
Climate change.
Right. So food then was in Egypt. So eventually they were then, the families that stayed there and the descendants were forced to be slaves in Egypt. Okay, that's how that happened. Then they were led out of Egypt by whom? Moses, right? He was the great prophet there. Okay, and then the Torah was revealed with its 613 laws. Okay, the next section, monarchy of David and Solomon. King David emerged and led the Israelite monarchy to its height of power. He politically unified all of Israel. He was royal, he was wealthy. Was he perfect? No. He made a lot of mistakes and God knew it, but apparently he did enough good things that he was considered king. Everybody, thought he was great. Now, the question that some people have, why don't Jews believe Jesus was the Messiah? Well, some of them did, and they became Christians, but not all of them did, and it's because David was seen, and is still seen, as the prototype of the Messiah, what the Messiah will be like. The Messiah is going to come, set things straight, like David did. David was wealthy, and Jesus was not. He was a peasant, right? Impoverished. David was royal. Jesus was not. Not in the traditional worldly sense of the word. I mean, we say like, Christ the King, like royal, but not in the traditional worldly sense. Wasn't wealthy, wasn't royal. He was politically involved some. He talked some, certainly, about helping the poor. That's hundreds of times Jesus talked about that. But he did not talk about toppling the Roman Empire. In fact, he forgave and befriended a centurion who was a Roman, right? Mm-hmm. Healed one of the daughters and, all that of the centurion. So David was politically very involved. and David politically unified Israel. Jesus was on some level politically involved when it came to the outcasts and the pushed down, but having nothing to do with the hierarchy and the upper echelon. And he did not politically unify all of Israel. So do you see how when you look at the prototype of David, how Jesus would have been like, how does that fit? Now some people said he is royal, he is wealthy in another non-traditional way. He is king, he is serving, but he's serving differently. He's serving by going down and washing feet and feeding people. He's not he's not ruling from top down like David. It's more like he's ruling from bottom up, like a servant. So some people said he is like David in a very different symbolic kind of way. Others said he's nothing like David. So can you see now why Jews would say, why would I think he's
Isn't that the David that whacked Goliath?
Yes.
Yeah, when he was younger.
Well, he started out as a lowly sheep herder,
Yes, he did.
so he sort of started out low too.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, but he became a king and he became all wealthy and people. Yeah, he had all this money and he, But he
did all
also
these wars.
he started wars and then he also got Bathsheba's husband killed in the front lines and then his child died because of it. I mean, it was like Grey's Anatomy over there. It was like soap opera, and so he was seen as, because he was sinful. Not that we're all not, I mean, we're all sinful, but because he had done these particular things, particularly with Uriah and Bathsheba, he was not allowed to be the one to build the temple. His son could build the temple, but he couldn't. It was almost like Moses, because he murdered somebody, was not allowed to go into the promised land. He could see the promised land. So there's a sense of like holding back with both Moses and with David. But still, David was so revered, and so people have thought the Messiah will be just like him. Somebody on high ruling. And Jesus showed us a very different kind of power. It's powerful. When we have Christ the King Sunday, we mean it. There is one king, and that's Christ. But it's a very different model of what royalty means and what power means and all that. So anyway, let's go to the next section, Babylonian exile. Okay, so there in the kingdom, there's the northern kingdom called Israel. There's the southern kingdom called Judah, later on called Judea, but same place. And it was unified during David's time. But then Solomon, his son, was king after him. Solomon built the temple. But the united monarchy was divided. So the northern kingdom, which was Israel, fell to the Assyrians. Do you see there, Assyrians? Mm-hmm. Go ahead and actually go back. Okay, please go back to the second paragraph where it talks about Egypt, and just circle the word Egypt. Okay, just for reference, just someplace in here where it says Egypt. Okay, anywhere where you see Egypt. Okay. All right, I'm gonna make a point in a little bit. Just trust me. Okay, now circle the word Assyrians. See where the northern kingdom fell with the Assyrians? Okay, the southern kingdom eventually, it endured a little while, but eventually fell to the Babylonians. So go ahead and circle the word Babylonians. Okay? So the Babylonians had a king, Nebuchadnezzar, who conquered the land and who kicked out the people. Destroyed the temple first, which was devastating. And who kicked out the people to exile in Babylon. Exile is different from Exodus. Remember the Exodus when they all left Egypt? Okay, exile means they're kicked out of the land, they're chosen, their sacred land, into Babylon. Eventually, the Persians, so circle the word Persians, conquered Babylon. See that?
Yeah.
Okay, now many actually, Jews returned from Babylon back into Judah, or now Judea, and rebuilt the temple, but not all of them did return. That started, I'm sorry?
The remnant.
Right, and that started what is now called the diaspora, because not all of them returned. Diaspora means dispersion. Okay, so now they're not all living together. Some of them returned, some of them didn't. Okay, they rebuilt the temple, and that's that section right there. Okay, next section. The Greeks conquered Palestine. So circle the word Greeks. You see that in that middle paragraph there? They totally changed things. Now, so far, the Jewish people had been oppressed and persecuted, by the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and now the Greeks. Okay, when the Greeks came in, the Greeks said, we're here now.
A history question.
Sure.
At that point in time, 332 BC,
Mhm.
Palestine encompassed what area?
Well, it was Israel and that whole region there. I don't know exactly what the borders were, but the whole region of Israel and the Middle East area.
Basically about the same as New Testament
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
From Sea of Galilee to
yeah, yeah.
Dead Sea.
Yeah, Israel, yeah. So the Greeks came in, and the Greeks literally moved in to the temple. Now the temple was rebuilt, and it's the holy, like it's known as the absolute, literal home of God. It's like the one home, right? Synagogues were not the one home. The temple was. So the temple was rebuilt, which was exciting, but the Greeks moved in. And the Greeks, were they monotheistic or were they polytheistic? Polytheistic. You know your Greek and Roman gods, right? And they brought in statues of all their many gods and goddesses, like they had in Greece. They brought them into the temple. Now this was a huge no-no,
Yes.
right? This
Yeah.
was a
God is
desecration
going to
of the
kill you.
temple. So people dealt with the Greeks in a few different ways. So if you could underline, don't circle like you did before with the other ones, but you might want to underline or at least find the word Sadducees. You see Sadducees?
I do.
They were like, well, let's just get along with the Greeks. I'm sure they mean well. We don't want to make waves. And so they stayed in the temple, the Sadducees, and the temple had temple sacrifices and all the rituals, and they allowed the Greeks to come in and they just wanted to get along because they didn't know what else to do. And they were used to the Jewish people being oppressed by this group and that group and this group and that group, and so the Greeks like one more, but someday they'll be gone. Another group though, the Essenes, do you see Essenes? Essenes were like, no way, Sadducees, we will have none of it. And they left town. They left Jerusalem, they left the temple, they went out into the desert, and they said, we're just going to do our own thing, way out of town. So the Essenes started being like the desert fathers, living off the land, living, really kind of roughly, eating whatever's crawling, and wearing whatever they could. They developed a water ritual of initiation, and so we believe that John the Baptist very well might have been an Essene, because where on earth did he get some water ritual? Out of nowhere? Probably from the Essenes, and he wore animal fur and stuff, and he ate the locusts and wild honey, so he's very much like an Essene. Then there was the Pharisees, so look at the word Pharisees, see that?
Yeah.
They also said, no way are we staying in the temple, but we don't want to just leave town like the Essenes. We're going to hang around, but we're not going to focus on the temple anymore, like the temple sacrifices. Instead, we're going to really focus on the Torah, on the word, on the law. Okay? That's how they all started dividing because of the Greeks. Okay, last paragraph there. Sure, yeah.
The Maccabees,
Yeah,
what-
that was a later.
what group, did they belong to any of these groups?
That's a really good question. I don't know. Yeah, I should look that up. That's a really good question. I really don't know. I would guess not the Sadducees. Maybe a scene. I really don't know. I'll go look it up. I'll let you know. Okay, so in 63 BC, the Romans conquered Palestine. So circle Romans. So do you see a trend of conquering the Jews? Okay. And this was brutal rule, way worse than any rule before. Did any of you ever see the Mel Gibson movie, Passion of the Christ? Remember how it was really hard to watch some of those scenes? And yet it was accurate. That kind of just absolute brutal crushing of the people is horrible. So the Jews initiated this revolt against them, this Jewish war. And it was won by the Romans. And they, in the year 70, destroyed the second temple. And again, absolute devastation for the Jews. It has not been rebuilt since. Huge loss. So what survived then was not the Sadducees. Because the Sadducees' way of doing Judaism was all about being in the temple. It was caught up in the temple sacrifices, and there was no temple anymore. So the Sadducees really kind of petered out and died. The way we today know Judaism is because of the Pharisees. Because the Essenes were off in the desert doing their own private personal thing. The Sadducees kind of died out because there was no temple anymore. But the Pharisees focused on the law, on the word, on analysis of the word, understanding the word. And so Jesus actually had more in common with the Pharisees than the others. Because Jesus didn't just go along with what was going on in the temple in his day. He didn't just go along with the powers in his day. Like, for instance, in his day, obviously he was in the Roman Empire and there was Roman rule, and there were tax collectors. Now, you know how in the Christian New Testament, tax collectors were hated. You know that, right? And the reason they were hated is because they were Jewish people working for the Romans. So they were seen as traitors. And they would collect huge amounts of taxes from the peasants to hand to the Romans, thrusting everybody into absolute poverty. So everybody hated the tax collectors. So Jesus wasn't like that. He wasn't working with the people so closely that he was like one of the traitors or one of them. But he also wasn't like the Essenes where he skipped town either. He very much stayed among the people and working among the people. He would occasionally retreat for private prayer, or go off by himself to pray, that kind of thing. But he stayed among the crowds, among the people. He went to the temple and all that. There was also a group at the time called the Zealots. And the Zealots were people who just wanted to fight. Just absolute warfare. And Jesus was not like that at all. I mean, we call him the Prince of Peace, right? Many times he could have picked up a sword, but he told Peter, not to do that. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. He was non-violent, really. And so he was most like the Pharisees of any of those people in that area. But we often think of the Pharisees as like, the arch enemy, because we hear in Scripture where Jesus is telling the Pharisees, no, that's not how you do things. But really they have a lot in common because they both considered the law to be very important. It's just that Jesus had a very non-traditional way of interpreting the law, a very different understanding. Plus, the Pharisees were not wanting to reach outside of their social circle, and Jesus did all the time. The Pharisees had a circle of like who was in, who was out, very clear, and Jesus was constantly reaching out. And in fact,
they were the ones always questioning.
Yeah, and trying to trap him.
Yeah.
Not really questioning because they wanted to learn, but questioning to trap him.
Oh, traffic.
Very legalistic, yeah. So, anyway, that's the ancient Israelites. Now, when we meet next week, we will move pretty quickly through the rest of the history because it's not as detailed as this. Into classical Judaism, medieval Judaism, which is absolutely fascinating, and the modern Judaism. But what you'll see throughout all of it is that the Holocaust did not come out of a vacuum. It was a progression of greater and greater and greater and greater oppression and violence and persecution and rumor that culminated in the Holocaust. But it's been there. Even in the ancient history that we went through, you've seen that the Jewish people have been conquered over and over and over and over and over, and have been victims of violence, really, and not being allowed to self-rule and self-govern over and over and over. So, a lot of us know modern history more than we know ancient history, and we just think that this weirdo Adolf Hitler came out of nowhere and people believed him for no reason, and not at all. It's because there had been a historical foundation laid over thousands of years like this. Truly, unfortunately, very, very insidious, very evil, but it's got a historical foundation. So anyway, we will look at that more next time. But right now, let's just talk amongst your tables just for a couple of minutes, let's say like 5 minutes. What stands out to you as some of the most interesting things we've talked about so far about Judaism, or were there any surprises? And then what could the rest of us that might not be practicing Jews learn from Judaism? Got it? So what's most interesting to you, or what were surprises? And what could any of us that aren't Jewish people learn from Judaism that might benefit us in any way? Got it? Okay, go for it. You only have 5 minutes. You can move around, there's another chair over there if you want, and, wherever you wanna go. Or Jerry, if you wanna join this table, whatever you wanna do. Join the guys.
Come on over here.
We're the cool guys.
We're
the cool guys. You will be once I'm there.
So it's kind of like a review almost.
Yes,
To,
yes,
yeah.
Yes, it is. Cause this is what we're studying, right?
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
This thing, I
No,
So-
just spelling of the words, the YH,
I think probably the one thing that
I've always seen that Yahweh,
Yeah.
but really it's sort of like.
strikes me the most is
Be
the
right back.
importance of the community itself, the,
Before south. Yeah, the
yeah,
focus on
totally.
the
Yeah, it's not,
Now, I've seen that,
I hear all
added
the
on to temples.
and
Yeah.
I personally move towards that within our Christian religion, the community more than that self type of thing.
Isn't there an airline?
When God gave the covenant, it's to the people, not to Jerry, not to Ben, and how, and if we work within that kind of, how are we as Christians, or how are we as people, if we're thinking in a communal context much more than, a personal context?
I think that what we can learn from that, I don't know if I want to do that though, where they digest, they take 3 verses and.
Put it in today's terms.
Well, they take 3 verses from the Bible and talk about it for an hour.
Yeah, but in today's terms.
Yeah, and
I mean,
that's
yeah,
what I
that's-
learned, and I've
that's
read the
good,
Bible
yeah.
a few times, and
But
you know what,
to
in my mind, I
that-
just, okay,
To
Start at the beginning.
get down
but
in religion
until
to
the
be
covenant,
that
there was no
specific, where I would
Israelite.
come
so
to
it's
a
like,
group
okay.
here like you
Yeah.
and say, okay, I got this dilemma.
Yeah.
My niece is marrying
The emphasis on.
whatever,
Community.
and he's not of Jewish faith. Should I go? When they
We're
get-
American,
Yeah.
that's what,
Yeah.
We wouldn't, I have
Personal
because,
thing with
because
us.
it's, I can kind of figure
The
that
other
out
thing
on my
that
own. And it doesn't
that
matter
always
to me
sticks out,
whether you
there's
think
a
I
verse
should
in
do
the
it or not,
Bible,
you know?
the New
Yeah.
Testament, I don't remember specifically exactly the words and such, but,
You know what I mean?
Jesus says something
I
to
shouldn't
the
do that
people, and they said,
because
we've never been slaves to anybody
Yeah.
They
before.
may believe in that, but I don't, so I'm not going to.
And every time I read that, I think to myself,
Well,
yeah.
do you not remember
Well,
your oral
it's not always how we work.
no, you weren't
No,
slaves to
We don't go to a
Rome,
group
Greece,
thing.
Babylon,
Very
Assyria,
often, what should I do?
Someone
We
who's
don't
important.
tend
you
to
know,
do that.
and probably throw in a few other ones, a little bit here and there.
Yes, they
you know,
Well,
do.
that's kind of that whole thing, so
What-
there's probably, it
So
seems
that
difficult
short-sighted,
to us or something we wouldn't want to do, but
Yeah.
it's still pretty interesting
Yes.
that they can do
And what
that.
did you find interesting?
And they're
Well, I'm
applying
like you,
4,000-year-old
I just find that
laws
the
to now
Israelites,
and
Yeah.
figuring it
I
out.
thought they
Now,
were
I
all
don't know,
captured.
they talk about that, then
made
what do they do with
slaves.
that?
But
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
after reading the
Is
Bible,
that
there,
then
I found
expected
out
for
that
the,
they
group,
went over
the
there
norm in the
because
group?
of hunger.
so we, you know,
I
we
don't
really
know
shouldn't
quite
go
how
into Best
it
Buy and
worked
look at
out.
TVs unless we're gonna buy
But
one, you know?
They
Cause,
became
that was
so.
just the
Well,
one.
it amazes
They became
me
too
how they're even
populous.
bothered by it.
Yeah,
Too many of
yeah.
them. The
And they
Egyptians
were,
got
they
scared,
were.
because that's what I remember
That's
reading.
right, there were
Yeah.
too many of them.
Well, it's
But
just
I-
that
That's
line,
why
what is
I-
right, what is
the
morally
certain
right or
beliefs I
ethically
have
right or wrong,
regards to that.
Yeah, I've seen it in Ben.
Yeah, so
But
they
when
had
he
to get
goes
rid of
to,
them, they go, what are we gonna do here?
garage sale or estate sale or something. If he goes in there and walks and nobody talks to him,
What are we gonna
he'll
do?
come right and walk out
So,
and
I
find
don't
something.
know,
But if
something
they
that
talk
I'd
to
like
him,
to
he
kind
feels
of
like
know
he needs
is,
to buy something from him.
did they, why,
Oh, yeah.
I guess they never
I
brought
think
them
that
into their
hits all
arms.
of us at one way.
Yeah.
shape,
Because they were
or form,
afraid
you
to,
know?
I guess,
When you think
to
of
bring them into
getting
their
involved
arms.
in something you
Yeah.
feel obligated.
well, they
Yes.
weren't,
They were there to
You
be,
stop,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
stop
They
at the grocery store. because
You
there's
organize
a
your
Boy Scout
own
or something,
in-
and a Girl Scout selling cookies.
and that's what
And
big
you'll ask,
mistake we
"Oh,
made
what
when we went
flavors
over
do
and
you
took
have?"
over,
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
fight
I
with
don't think I
Iran
want
and all that
to.
stuff.
No, then that
we went and dissolved their army. What we should have
Just
done
say no up front.
was
You don't want it.
keep their arms and keep our
Not
fingers,
today, I'm sorry.
Or when you go to the
Self
toilet,
over.
use the
But
bathroom,
we
you gotta
did.
buy a cup of coffee.
Right, yeah.
Hey,
well,
That is,
I
that
don't
is.
know. I,
But there's something also to be said of doing it doing it either way. You know, Rome was happy to adopt
Right.
other armies.
yeah, they
Yeah,
did.
because
That was,
you
yeah,
They
like-
incorporated
but in
Europe.
Europe-
Yeah.
we'll let you,
Right?
just,
We
just
just
make sure you're doing what we want you to do, we
Except
don't
for the
care what you
Germanic tribes, they didn't get them.
So then maybe that's the
Germanic
Jewish
people
people
had-
figured that out.
Okay, let's have, just a
Anyway,
little bit to
I
wrap up
just
your
find it
sentences.
Interesting, very interesting.
We were, what surprised us, what was new and.
Okay, so
we
what did you
found
all say?
interesting.
What's interesting? Let's hear from this group. What do you think?
They do a lot of the
Oh, okay,
meetings.
let's hear from this group.
Or Paul.
Okay, yeah, whatever.
You're
It's
okay. No,
They
please.
do a lot of meetings and share a lot of personal stuff where it seems strange.
Yeah, I
We
mean,
talked about like where they, when they got together and talked about the Torah and
Oh.
just specific verses and
Yes.
debating and telling each other, and we just thought, we don't do stuff like that.
No, it's not our tradition.
And
Yeah.
It's interesting.
It is, and I think Lutheranism is changing, for sure, and it should. We've got such good theology, I think. I mean, I'm totally biased, right? Because, I chose to be a Lutheran, I wasn't like raised here. But I love the theology so much, but what I want us to do is open up. There's a movement now called decolonized Lutheranism. It's not just for the Scandinavians anymore, which, good.
What?
I'm not a Scandinavian, so I hope not, right?
you look like you are.
I am not. And so, yeah, but I mean, we want it to be open to all people, right? We don't want it just to be about a Norwegian little culture. Nothing wrong with Norway. We love Norway, but we want it to be like open to all folks.
Don't try to
So,
buy a Greenland.
yeah, I mean, yeah, no, we want it to be like the
I've
whole
been to that
planet.
awful place.
So,
Hated that place.
but there's that joke about Scandinavians, the culture of Scandinavia, and I really hope I don't offend anybody by saying this, but that joke of how do you know an extroverted Scandinavian? They're looking at the other person's shoes when they're talking to them, right? Rather than just their own. Like they're so bold to get out there. So that's obviously a cultural stereotype of Scandinavians being quieter, right? And more reserved
Yeah,
and more
but-
stoic.
When we went to that pool where you go in Iceland or Greenland,
Uh-huh.
where were we?
Iceland.
Where you go to that big green pool, what's it called?
No idea.
The blue pool.
The Blue Lagoon is
Blue
what it
Lagoon.
Oh.
that was a big
She's
tourist
colorful.
thing, and you go in there,
Yeah.
you're just supposed to go in there, get naked, shower, everybody
Wow.
watching everybody,
Okay.
And they go, well, we know you Americans don't like to do that, so we did set it up so it's a little different.
Huh, okay.
And yeah,
Thoughtful.
so, yes, but
Yeah.
they're much more open
Right.
about other things.
Interesting. Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah. All over Paris, there's not a statue that's clothed. I mean,
Yes.
it's, yeah, so I mean, different cultures are different about different things. But it's generally not a Lutheran thing to get into a room and start debating loudly scripture, right? But it's more of a tradition. It's a Jewish tradition to debate like that. Yeah, so good. I'm glad you brought that up. So that's interesting or surprising or what you would want to do or what I'm sorry?
It seems a little weird.
A little weird. Yeah,
I
just
kind of
different.
brought it up as something we could learn from them,
Yeah.
not that, then we kind of went, well, we couldn't do it.
Yeah, we
learned from
could.
it, But we were like,
We could if we all agreed that we all are doing it in love and, but yeah, people are different, you do what your parents do. I mean, we model after those who teach us how to
And
do
it
it.
just took us down the trail of talking about ethics and how,
Yeah.
it would be our personal ethics and not someone else telling us.
Yeah, we
Right.
tend not to ask anybody else some of
Yeah.
these questions.
Yeah, right.
And, and there's differences that
Yeah.
you don't always, you marry into a family, you don't always know all those traditions.
Right, exactly. Yeah, thank you. How about this table? What'd you all talk about?
We talked more about the history,
Yeah.
the cult, the covenant.
Covenant, yeah.
How they came about.
Yeah.
How they came about.
I wasn't aware that that's, with that covenant, it basically was the basis for the Jewish religion.
Oh, yeah,
You know, it's-
right.
So
Right.
it was from the, I'm reading my Bible, the world was created, Okay.
Here we got
Jewish.
Jews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody's Jewish.
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, it's from that covenant and then the sign of the covenant of circumcision, which is like God's greatest joke on humanity. There's so many jokes written about that, like, God, are you sure you don't mean to cut our hair?
Yeah,
Trim our fingernails? So.
You'd have to strip somebody to see if they were.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
You would.
So there's not a whole lot of adult male converts? Because of that?
What?
There's not a whole lot of adult male converts
Oh.
to Judaism because of that.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Especially if you're in the Blue Lagoon.
So you're right, exactly. Nowhere to hide.
When you
So
get
anyway.
past, when you get past a certain age, they use pinking shoes.
Oh my, pinky shoes.
My,
All right, we need to.
I had a brother and he was circumcised and he died.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
He died from a
Got
circumcision?
gangrene and died.
Aw, you're
Had a brother.
kidding. Oh my goodness, I've never heard of that. I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
Jeez.
it happened.
It was before he was born.
Oh my
Yeah,
goodness.
it was my brother, he was like my older brother.
Oh my
Between
gosh.
my sister and I,
Wow.
and he died. His name was Robert.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even know that was
I'm looking
possible.
forward to going to heaven and seeing him.
Yeah, really. Yeah,
I really am.
I bet. It's cool. So, what could we learn from Judaism that we've looked at so far?
How to debate.
Yeah. Yeah.
How to talk.
Yeah, how to
Each
talk.
other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, be
I
able to get things
disagree.
out there. Loving what you did there, Kevin.
Well, what-
And then Tom's like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, sometimes, like, I really liked, and I don't want to talk about the whole sanctuary thing right now, we're not going to do that. But those of you who came out, probably did all of you come out? Probably most of you anyway. I liked how we were able to share a variety of
Yes.
opinions. So if we could learn that, how to be respectful around the table where we're not all identical, and yet we can all share and still love each other and still get along, and that's a beautiful thing. In fact, that might be a witness to the world about how we can learn to do that kind of thing. So we can learn that. What else could we learn from Judaism?
Well, one of the things that I mentioned was that the community,
Mm-hmm.
the community is as important as the individual,
Right.
and that it's not necessarily even just a inside here,
Mm-hmm.
but out in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I worked with a lot of Jewish doctors and so on like that. And I was really you could kind of say I was in the inner circle
Mm-hmm.
because I traveled with them and so on. And so I did see both the observant and the non-observant Jewish. And the thing that surprised me was excuse me, the ones that I thought would have been observant weren't.
Mm.
I find that hard to believe. And I've been to bar mitzvahs and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I've seen them read from it, and like you say, they'd have that little pointer.
Yeah.
And I remember the rabbi going at one bar mitzvah. I think the young man missed where he was reading, and he went over and pointed
Oh yeah, might have helped him
where
out.
it was at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's
And
cool.
like you say, it was a language that you don't hear very
Mhm.
often.
Mhm.
And I asked, I said, man, how did you learn how to read that? And he says, oh, I've been going to this thing, and the kid was very upset. I said, I've been going to this thing for months to learn this. Months to
Yeah.
learn it. And the rabbi there, he was saying, you did a good job reading
Good.
like that.
Yeah.
And he became a doctor too.
Yeah. I just took one semester of Hebrew in seminary, and it's so hard
Yeah.
compared to. I mean, I took Greek also, and then I took French in college, and Hebrew is so much harder because there's no vowels,
Yeah.
punctuation. Who needs punctuation?
Yeah.
And reading from right to left, and then a word can mean several different things
Yes.
depending on the content. I mean, just wow. So for children to do that, that's amazing,
Yeah.
super cool.
Yeah, well, like he was 13, 14 years
Yeah,
old.
right. But to have that
I
connection,
knew
you know,
from
to
then
the
and
past,
then
to their ancestors.
Became a doctor and
Yeah.
all that kind
Yeah.
of stuff, and I worked with him and so on.
Absolutely.
So.
Well, in the next 2 sessions that we meet, well, 1 or probably 2, we'll see how it goes. We're gonna finish up looking at Jewish history, and all of it is all of this is in a nutshell. I mean, you can stretch out any of this, but we will briefly look at the rest of Jewish history. And then we will look at daily life as a Jew, and the calendar year, some of the major holidays, some of the major rituals, and how to be an observant Jew. Like, what does that mean? What does it mean to eat kosher and to go to synagogue and all that? And then different rituals that have surrounding death and birth and all kinds of, you know, marriage, weddings, things like that. Just what does it mean to like live a life as a Jew? Because remember, like Abraham Joshua Heschel said, to be a Jew means living in the Jews of the past, but with the Jews of the present. So community in both ways, of the ancient times and now. How do we live together as a community and a congregation? So, thank you all for being here tonight, for coming on out. And I will see you sooner than next Wednesday, but I will also see you next Wednesday to continue to continue talking about this. So thank you very much.
I have a question. Do you have any idea, let's see, I guess you would call it the ethnic Jewish population in the United States? What percentage of them are observant Jews?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that there's only about like 18 million Jews right now in the whole world, which is very small. The only reason it's considered a major world religion is because of its influence on everybody else. So, and a lot of the world's Jews are in America, you know, but how many of them are observant versus
I'd say very little.
cultural? I don't know.
I'd say very little
I've
what
not
I
looked that up. I can
meant.
look that up, but that'd be a Google
The
question.
Jewish people that I know, I think most of them, I didn't really ask them, but most of them did not seem like observant.
Yeah, yeah.